Welcome back to Business Book Breakdowns. If you're enjoying these deep dives, go ahead and hit that like button, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, all that good stuff. So today we are diving into women, money, power. It's really fascinating looking at the fight for economic equality in the U.S. And we're talking like all the way from World War II to today. It's a big one.
Yeah, it spans like a good chunk of history. And it's not just, dry facts and figures. This book is really driven by those personal stories of the women who, broke those barriers and kind of shook things up.
Okay, so to kick things off, World War II, right? The book starts there. And it opens with these three sisters, the Burkett sisters, who left, like their rural lives, to work at a Boeing factory during the war.
Yeah, and they're a perfect example, right? Like millions of women entered the workforce during World War II. Think about it, before the war, being a homemaker, that was kind of the expectation for most women. So this was a huge, huge shift.
Yeah, and these weren't just like temporary jobs, right? The book talks about these women learning these new skills, operating machinery. They're contributing to the war effort in ways that, women just hadn't before. So that must have been empowering, but like what happened when the war ended? Did things just go back to how they were?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right? Because legally, women were still very much behind, and we're talking about things like coverture.
Okay, coverture, break that down.
Basically, it meant that a woman didn't have her own independent legal identity. Like, think about this. Women couldn't even get a credit card in their own name until the 1970s.
Ooh.
Yeah, it was tied to, like, their father or husband or jury duty. Women weren't guaranteed that right until 1957 at the federal level.
It's wild to think about.
It's crazy.
So they're contributing so much, but they're still seen as, like, legal dependents. That's a wild contrast.
It is.
Does the book talk about the long-term effects of that? Like, how did that impact women financially, even after the war ended?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's a good reminder that, progress isn't always a straight line. Even as women are, fighting for equality in the workforce, they're still battling these fundamental legal barriers. And that's actually why, the contraceptive revolution was so significant.
Okay, let's talk about that, because this book goes deep on this.
Yeah.
Like Catherine McCormick.
Yeah.
This woman defied the law to fund and smuggle diaphragms into the U.S. She sounds like a total badass.
She was. She was super committed to this vision that Margaret Sanger had of making birth control accessible.
And of course, we can't forget the pill.
Yeah.
I mean, the development of the birth control pill. Did the book talk about the societal but also the economic, ripple effects of that invention?
Oh, yeah, it does. And it's fascinating because they actually cite studies that link the pill to, get this, one third of the wage gains for women in their 40s during the 80s and 90s. That's huge. But it makes sense, right? When you can control your reproductive choices, you can invest more in education, you can pursue a career with, less fear of unplanned pregnancies. It's kind of a classic example of how these things that you might not think are related are totally interconnected.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of things that kind of shook things up, the book also talks about Betty Friedan and the feminine mystique, which I feel like, everyone had to read in college. But it was such a lightning bolt when it came out. It called out that dissatisfaction that so many women felt being, confined to that role of housewife.
And it wasn't just about, individual feelings, right? It sparked a movement. And that book was huge in terms of the fight for equal pay, which, amazing women like Esther Peterson were really spearheading.
It wasn't an easy fight, though, right? Didn't the book mention opposition from, like, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce? What were their arguments against equal pay?
Well, I think it shows how progress often faces pushback, especially when it's challenging that existing power structure, right? And in this case, the idea of women earning the same as men, for doing the same work, that was really threatening to a system that, frankly, benefited from that inequality.
Totally. Now, the book also talks about this woman, Polly Murray, and her story. She was this incredible, legal scholar and activist who fought for both gender and racial equality. And her work on intersectionality, I feel like that's so relevant today, maybe even more so than ever.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can't even talk about something like the wage gap without acknowledging that women of color, they're disproportionately affected. So her work is such an important reminder that the fight for equality, it has to be intersectional. It has to address those very specific challenges that different groups are facing.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of ongoing fights, the book also talks about the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA.
Yes.
which, again, you would think would be a no-brainer to have in the Constitution.
Right, exactly.
It's crazy. It's still not there.
Well, I think it just goes to show how hard it is to enshrine this kind of social progress into law. And the ERA, it faced fierce opposition. Like Phyllis Schlafly.
Yes.
She was a huge opponent.
Big time.
She argued it would harm women, that it would, take away things like alimony or force them into the draft. And it's interesting because even though the ERA ultimately failed, the book really presents it as this turning point in the women's rights movement.
Why is that?
Because even in defeat, it was galvanizing, right? It got people fired up, it sparked all this debate and activism, and it really forced the issue of gender equality into the national spotlight.
Totally, totally. And it kept the conversation going.
Yes.
Which is so important.
Absolutely.
Even when it's difficult. And speaking of difficult, the book also tells the story of Muriel Siebert.
Oh, yeah.
First woman to own a seat on the New York Stock Exchange.
Talk about breaking a glass ceiling, right?
It's huge. And talk about an uphill battle.
Yeah, the sexism and the resistance that she faced were unbelievable. But it's not just about breaking barriers, right? It's what she did after.
What do you mean?
She became this huge advocate for financial literacy, especially among women. She understood that real empowerment comes from, knowledge and access.
I love that. And it makes me think about financial literacy. It plays such a big role in all of this, in the larger conversation about economic equality. Did the book talk about that connection more?
Oh, it does. And that leads really well into this whole other concept that I think is so fascinating but also infuriating, and that's the glass cliff.
Okay, I've heard that term before, but remind me.
Okay, so imagine this. You've worked your butt off, right? And finally, you break through to this leadership position.
Amazing, right?
Right? Sounds great. Except that very often women are promoted into these roles during times of crisis. Like the company's already on shaky ground.
So it's like they're being set up to fail.
Exactly. It's a very subtle form of discrimination. Hard to call out, but it has real consequences. And the book gives some good examples of this, like Mary Barra at General Motors and then Anne Mulcahy at Xerox, both appointed CEO during these major crises.
So even when women reach the top, it's still
not equal.
It's still not equal. It makes you wonder, what are the more insidious ways that this inequality plays out, the things that maybe we don't even realize are happening?
Well, I think one of the big ones is unpaid labor.
Oh, yeah. I feel like that's a big one.
It is, right. Unpaid labor. Think about all the work that goes into, running a household, raising a family, childcare, cooking, cleaning, just the mental load of it all. And so much of that still falls on women, even when they are working outside the home.
Yeah. Like a second job.
Yeah.
But you don't get paid for it?
Exactly. And the book, actually, there's this crazy stat. They say unpaid work by women is estimated to be worth something like $11 trillion globally each year.
Trillion.
Trillion. With a T? So think about, the economic boost if that labor was, valued and compensated fairly.
Totally. And that makes me think about, we're talking about progress not being linear.
Yeah.
It makes me think about Roe v. Wade being overturned. Did the book touch upon how something like reproductive rights, how that ties into women's economic lives?
Well, absolutely. Yeah. And it's a good reminder that, progress can be fragile, but restricting access to abortion has these huge ripple effects.
Right.
It limits a woman's ability to control her fertility, which can, derail education plans, career trajectories. It can really trap women in these cycles of poverty. So we have to see these things as connected. Reproductive rights are fundamentally linked to economic equality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
100%. It's like when you talk about, closing the wage gap and shattering these glass ceilings, but then something like this happens and it feels like we're taking a huge step back.
The book does a good job of, there's a lot of nuance in there, right? All these different facets of women's experiences. And even in an industry like tech, which you think would be more progressive.
Right. You would think, a field that's all about innovation would be leading the charge on this.
Yeah.
But it's more complicated than that.
And the book talks about the Pow effect.
Yes.
Named after Ellen Pow, of course.
Right.
Remind me about that case.
So she filed a gender discrimination lawsuit against her former employer, which was this big venture capital firm. And, she ultimately lost. But it was like this crack in the dam because her willingness to come forward and, challenge the system, it kind of emboldened other women in tech to kind of come forward with their own stories of harassment, discrimination, bias.
And it started a conversation. Exactly. Even if the legal outcome wasn't what everyone wanted, it kind of exposed this bro culture that was so prevalent,
Totally. Does the book talk about, a funding gap, too?
Yeah. And it's a huge one. Women-led startups receive significantly less funding than those founded by men. We're talking a fraction of the investment capital.
And that's even when you account for experience in the industry and all of that.
Yes.
It's crazy.
So then it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
Exactly.
Because if investors don't believe in women-led businesses, then those businesses are going to have a harder time succeeding. And then it reinforces the bias.
Totally. It just becomes this vicious cycle.
Yeah. But the book offers solutions too, right? It's not just
absolutely not.
doom and gloom. It's not all doom and gloom.
Yeah.
And a big one is financial literacy, like especially for women, right?
Yeah.
Just understanding how money works, how to invest, how to build wealth, that is so empowering.
Totally. It's like that old saying, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach a man the fish, you feed him for a lifetime.
Right.
But
yeah.
it's like, let's make sure that women have fishing rods too.
I love that. And the book takes it even further. It's not just about individual, knowledge. It's about social accountability. It's about companies and organizations.
Putting their money where their mouth is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because it's not enough to just hope things will change. We all have a role to play.
Totally.
Yeah.
So what does that look like in practice? What are some concrete things that organizations are doing differently?
So a big one that the book talks about is pay transparency.
Okay.
Instead of salaries being this big secret, they're openly discussed, they're compared, so you can actually make sure everyone's being paid fairly.
I love that.
Right.
Takes the guesswork out of it.
Exactly. And then another big one is childcare, affordable childcare.
Huge.
The book highlights companies that are doing things like offering on-site childcare, or they're subsidizing the cost of it. It's recognizing that, especially for mothers, but really any working parent, childcare is a huge barrier.
It's huge.
Yeah.
And it's not just a personal responsibility.
Right.
It's a societal issue.
Right.
When companies can provide that support, it's good for them too.
It's a win-win.
Yeah,
it's not just these big things, though. It's the everyday stuff, too, calling out sexist language when you hear it, supporting businesses owned by women.
Yeah.
Just advocating for these policies.
Totally. It's those little actions.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's not going to be solved overnight.
It's a process.
Yeah. It's changing hearts and minds one conversation at a time.
Yeah. And I think that can feel really daunting, right? How are we ever going to get there? But it's also empowering.
It feels hopeful.
Yeah. Because it means we all have a part to play.
It makes me think about that quote by, Margaret Mead. That never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has.
I love that. And I think this book does a good job of showing that those small groups don't have to be out there changing the whole world, Right? It can be in our workplaces, our communities, our families, just having those tough conversations and challenging each other.
Yeah, I love that. It does. And it's not just about big splashy initiatives. The book also emphasizes those everyday actions.
Yeah, right.
Like calling out that sexist language when you hear it, supporting those businesses owned by women, advocating for the policies that promote gender equality.
Exactly.
All of it.
Because those things add up, right?
They do, yeah.
It's not this thing that's going to be solved overnight.
Right.
It's about slow, steady work of changing hearts and minds.
One conversation, one action at a time.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I know this might sound kind of cheesy, but it makes me think of that quote. I think it's Margaret Mead. It's never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has.
I love that. And this book does such a good job of showing that, those small groups, they don't have to be out there changing the whole world. It can be in our workplaces, in our communities, even just in our families,
Totally. Just having those conversations.
Yeah. Challenging each other and pushing each other to do better.
I love that. So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, which has been amazing, both inspiring and challenging and everything in between, for our listeners who are feeling fired up, they want to keep going with this, what are some of the key takeaways from the book that they can kind of carry with them?
Well, I think first and foremost, this fight's not over.
Right.
Right.
Not even close.
There's been progress, but we got a long way to go, right?
Oh.
And it's going to take all of us kind of doing our part to really create that more just and equitable world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
It's a beautiful thought. And this book, Women, Money, Power, it's like a roadmap, or at least part of the roadmap.
Yeah, totally.
It's that call to action that's source of inspiration. And it reminds us we're not alone. And that together we can actually make a difference.
100%.
So good. And speaking of making a difference, if you're enjoying this deep dive into women, money, power, we would love it if you would like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out. Helps us get the word out and just keep these important conversations going.
Awesome.
And don't forget, you can grab your own copy of the book. The link is down in the description. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time for another one.